The letter lay on my doormat, a stark white rectangle against the polished wood. My name, David Miller, was printed neatly, along with the sender's, the Homeowners Association, specifically, its iron-fisted president, Brenda. My hands trembled as I tore it open. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat, a cold shock that spread through my entire body. Demand for payment, $840,000. The number screamed off the page, an impossible sum. $840,000. For what? My eyes darted to the fine print, the accusations of unapproved landscaping changes and structural infractions. But then, my gaze snagged on a small, grainy picture tucked into the corner of the paper, a recent satellite image, I presumed, of my property line. It showed a new fence, pristine and white, not where my fence should be, but several feet inside my land, effectively carving off a chunk of my backyard. And beyond that fence, clearly visible, was a vibrant, freshly planted flower bed, brimming with bright red petunias and neatly trimmed shrubs. Brenda's signature garden, I realized with a horrifying jolt. She was demanding nearly $1 million from me, claiming I owed the HOA for things that were either fictional or, worse, for changes she herself had made by illegally squatting on my property. My heart hammered against my ribs, a panic drum. How had this nightmare begun, and what other secrets was she hiding, lurking beneath the seemingly calm surface of our suburban street? This couldn't be real. Just 6 months earlier, my biggest worry had been which shade of beige paint would look best in my new living room. Moving to Maple Creek cul-de-sac had been a dream come true. It was a quiet, tree-lined street with houses that all had neat green lawns and welcoming porches. I, David Miller, a software developer who spent most of his days staring at lines of code, had always dreamed of owning a little piece of the world, a place where I could put down roots and perhaps even grow a few vegetables. This house, a charming 2-story with a big backyard, was more than just a building. It was a canvas for a new chapter, a space to fill with laughter and kindness, a place where I could finally feel truly at home. I believed in being a good neighbor, in sharing a smile, and helping out whenever I could. My parents, who had always taught me the importance of community, would have been proud. My first few weeks were a blur of unpacking boxes, painting walls, and getting to know the rhythm of the neighborhood. The mornings were filled with the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Afternoons brought the shouts of children playing down the street. It all felt idyllic. One sunny Saturday morning, while I was struggling to assemble a wobbly patio table in my backyard, a cheerful voice called out from over the fence. "Need a hand there, sweetie?" It was Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor. She was a kind-faced woman with sparkling blue eyes and a permanent aura of freshly baked cookies. She always had a comforting smile and a gentle way of speaking. She lived alone, her children grown and moved away, but her garden was meticulously cared for, a riot of colorful blooms. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson. Thanks, but I think I've almost got it," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. She chuckled, leaning on the fence. "You know, that table looks just like the one my grandson tried to put together last year. Took him 3 tries and a whole lot of muttered words." Her easygoing nature immediately put me at ease. We chatted for a while, about the neighborhood, about my plans for the house, and she offered some tips on getting rid of persistent weeds. She seemed genuinely happy to have a new neighbor. Then there was Brenda. Brenda lived 3 houses down, in the largest, most immaculately kept house on the street. Her lawn was always a perfect shade of emerald green, her bushes sculpted into precise geometric shapes. I first met her a few days after moving in, when she arrived at my doorstep with a plate of homemade cookies, slightly burnt around the edges, I noted, which seemed out of character for someone so particular. She was a tall woman, with a stern expression that barely softened even when she smiled, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail, judging. She introduced herself as Brenda Peterson, the president of the Maple Creek HOA. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice crisp and formal, even for a welcome. "I'm Brenda Peterson, president of our homeowners association. These are for you." She pushed the plate of cookies into my hands as if performing a duty rather than a gesture of goodwill. "Now, I've brought you a copy of our HOA bylaws. They're quite extensive, but it's important you familiarize yourself with them. We take community standards very seriously here." She spoke for a good 20 minutes, rattling off rules about everything from the exact height of grass blades, no more than 3 inches, to the approved colors for mailboxes, earth tones only, no brights. She mentioned fines for violations, emphasizing the importance of keeping our community pristine. I nodded politely, trying to absorb it all, though a part of me felt a little overwhelmed. I had expected some rules, of course, but Brenda made them sound like a military code. I thanked her for the cookies and the bylaws, promising to read through them carefully. Over the next few weeks, I tried my best to be a model homeowner. I mowed my lawn religiously, kept my trash cans neatly out of sight until collection day, and even spent a weekend painting my mailbox a respectable shade of dark brown, just to be safe. I genuinely wanted to fit in, to be part of a harmonious community. My approach to life had always been one of openness and a willingness to understand different perspectives. I believed that most people, given the chance, wanted to do good and contribute positively to their surroundings. I tried to apply this same principle to Brenda, seeing her strictness as perhaps a well-meaning, if slightly overzealous, desire for order. I noticed Brenda seemed to be everywhere. She was always out walking her tiny, yappy dog, seemingly patrolling the street. I'd see her peering over fences, or pausing to examine a lawn. Once, I saw her stooping down to measure a patch of grass with a small, retractable tape measure. It seemed a bit much, but I just shrugged it off as her dedication to the HOA. Maybe she just really loved rules. One afternoon, I decided to brighten up my front porch. I bought 2 lovely terracotta pots and filled them with vibrant, cheerful petunias, not the red ones Brenda would later claim, but a mix of sunny yellows and soft purples. They looked beautiful, adding a pop of color to the otherwise muted tones of my house. The next day, there was a neatly folded note tucked under my doormat. It was from Brenda. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began, in precise, almost calligraphic handwriting. "Regarding the potted plants on your front porch. While aesthetically pleasing, our HOA guidelines stipulate that all exterior decorative elements, including potted plants, must be approved by the Architectural Review Board. Furthermore, the color palette of said plants should adhere to the subtle earth tones and muted naturals directive, as outlined in Section 4.c.2 of the bylaws. Vibrant hues, such as the yellows and purples currently displayed, are deemed non-compliant. Please remove or replace these items within 72 hours to avoid a Level 1 infraction fine of $150. I reread the note several times, a frown creasing my forehead. Potted plants? Unapproved colors? It seemed utterly ridiculous. I went back to the bylaws, flipping through the pages. Sure enough, buried deep within a section about exterior modifications, there was a tiny clause about requiring approval for any permanent or semi-permanent exterior decorative elements. It didn't explicitly mention potted plants, but Brenda's interpretation was clear. The subtle earth tones directive was there too, vague enough to be applied to almost anything. I sighed. It felt like a small, petty attack, but I didn't want trouble. I liked my new neighborhood. I simply swapped the petunias for some ferns, which were undeniably green and, I hoped, Brenda approved. I still believed in being understanding, in finding common ground. Days turned into weeks, and Brenda's little corrections became more frequent. A notice about my recycling bin being visible for 10 minutes too long on collection day. A complaint about the precise shade of my new doormat. It was always small things, always accompanied by a gentle reminder of the potential for fines. Each time, I complied, even as a tiny knot of frustration began to tighten in my stomach. I noticed other neighbors seemed to walk on eggshells around Brenda too. One day, I saw Mr. Henderson quickly pull his lawnmower back into his garage when he saw Brenda turn the corner on her walk. Mrs. Henderson, my sweet next-door neighbor, started giving me subtle warnings. "Brenda takes her job very seriously, dear," she'd say, leaning over the fence as I watered my, now all-green, plants. Her voice would drop to a whisper. "She can be particular." My advice? Just keep your head down and don't give her any reason to notice you. Her eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place: fear? Resignation? It made me wonder what history lay beneath Brenda's perfectly manicured surface. I tried to follow Mrs. Henderson's advice. I kept my yard immaculate, read through the HOA bylaws countless times, and tried to be as invisible as possible. But it felt wrong. It felt like walking on eggshells in my own home. I wanted to be a good neighbor, not a scared one. I wanted to build connections, not just follow rules designed to maintain an artificial perfection. This community felt less like a collection of kind-hearted people and more like Brenda's personal fiefdom. Then came the incident with the bird feeder. I loved watching the birds in my backyard. Their cheerful songs and bright colors brought a sense of peace to my busy days. I decided to install a small, simple bird feeder on a pole near the back fence, away from the house. It was a rustic wooden one, nothing fancy, and within a few days, it was a popular spot for sparrows and finches. I thought it was a harmless, even charming, addition to my yard. 3 days later, another letter arrived from Brenda. This one was different. It wasn't a gentle reminder. It was an official notice of violation and fine. My heart sank as I read it. The violation? Attraction of vermin and unapproved alteration of natural habitat. The fine? A staggering $1,500. For a bird feeder. And the letter didn't stop there. It stated that if the feeder wasn't removed within 24 hours, the fine would double, and legal action would be pursued. I stared at the paper, my mind reeling. $1,500? For birds? It was ludicrous. This wasn't just petty anymore, it felt like a deliberate act of malice. This was the moment I realized Brenda wasn't just particular, she was actively hostile. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach, knowing that this was only the beginning of her unreasonable demands. The $1,500 fine for the bird feeder hit me like a cold wave. It wasn't just the money, it was the sheer unfairness of it all. Attraction of vermin? The only things attracted were cheerful little finches and plump robins. Unapproved alteration of natural habitat? It was a small wooden box on a pole. My first reaction was a flash of hot anger. This was beyond nitpicking, this was a deliberate act meant to intimidate. I stared at the letter, my jaw tight. This couldn't stand. I believed in fairness, in finding reasonable solutions, but Brenda was making that impossible. It was time to push back, even if just a little. I considered calling Brenda directly, but something in my gut told me that would be pointless. Her letters were always so formal, so final. Instead, I carefully took down the bird feeder, the cheerful chirping suddenly absent from my yard. It hurt, like giving up a small piece of joy. But I decided I needed to understand the game Brenda was playing. I spent the next few evenings hunched over the HOA bylaws, reading every single word, highlighting clauses, and making notes. I hoped to find some forgotten rule, some hidden exception that would prove her wrong. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, a way to make sense of her extreme behavior. I searched for anything about bird feeders, about vermin, about habitat alteration. Nothing specific. The rules were vague enough that she could stretch them to fit almost any situation, a chilling realization. It seemed her power came not from clear rules, but from her willingness to interpret them however she wished, and to enforce those interpretations with heavy fines. My lawn, already cut to a precise 2 inches, seemed to mock me with its perfection. My mailbox, once a cheerful red, was now a dull, Brenda-approved brown. Every small effort I made to personalize my home, to infuse it with my own spirit, seemed to be met with her cold, unyielding hand. I felt a growing sense of being watched, a constant, low-level anxiety that stole some of the joy from my new home. I thought about the core principles I lived by: kindness, empathy, the belief that communication could solve most problems. But how could you communicate with someone who seemed to operate on a different planet, a world where a bird feeder was a monstrous crime? I went over to Mrs. Henderson's one afternoon, ostensibly to ask for gardening advice, but really, I wanted to talk about Brenda. Mrs. Henderson was pruning her rose bushes, her movements slow and deliberate. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "David, dear. What a pleasant surprise. Are your ferns thriving?" I mumbled something about the ferns, then cleared my throat. "Mrs. Henderson, I had another letter from Brenda. About my bird feeder. She fined me $1,500. Mrs. Henderson stopped pruning, her hands still. She slowly stood up straight, her blue eyes losing their usual sparkle. A deep sigh escaped her lips. "Oh, David. I was afraid of this." She shook her head sadly. "Brenda can be quite zealous. She sees herself as the guardian of Maple Creek, you see. The one who keeps everything perfect." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if she feared Brenda might be listening from beyond the hedges. "She's been president for years, ever since old Mr. Jenkins moved away. And before that, she was secretary, then vice president. She knows every single rule, and she remembers every past infraction, no matter how small." "But $1,500 for a bird feeder?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "It's absurd. It doesn't even say anything about them in the bylaws specifically." "No, it doesn't," Mrs. Henderson agreed, her gaze distant. "But Brenda has a way of interpreting things. And she always seems to get her way. Most people just pay the fines, David. It's easier than fighting her. She makes it very difficult to argue. She's got the whole board wrapped around her finger, you see. They're all either her close friends or people who don't want to upset her. It's been that way for a long time." Her words painted a clearer picture of Brenda's power, a kind of silent dictatorship. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. It explained the quiet resignation I saw in other neighbors' eyes. Mrs. Henderson offered me a glass of lemonade, and we sat on her porch swing. "My dear, I learned a long time ago that sometimes, the best thing to do is pick your battles. Life is too short to fight over every little thing." Her advice, born of years of quiet observation, weighed heavily on me. It was pragmatic, but it went against my very nature to simply accept injustice. I wanted to believe that if I just kept being kind, kept trying to understand, things would eventually smooth out. But Brenda seemed immune to kindness. I started paying closer attention to Brenda's daily routine. She'd wake up early, always impeccably dressed, and walk her small terrier, Penny. She'd pause in front of different houses, sometimes pulling out a small notepad and pen. I saw her speak to other neighbors, usually in hushed tones, sometimes pointing at something in their yards. Most people would nod quickly, almost nervously, before hurrying back inside. Only a few, like the young couple down the street, the Patels, would occasionally try to reason with her, but their conversations always ended with them looking defeated. I realized Brenda's power wasn't just about the fines, it was about the constant pressure, the feeling of being under a magnifying glass. She didn't have to shout, her stern gaze and a neatly written note were enough to enforce compliance. It was a subtle form of oppression, slowly eroding the sense of peace and freedom in one's own home. This wasn't the community I had envisioned. I thought about the inspiring stories I'd read, where people stood up for what was right, not just for themselves but for others. Could I be that person? Could I stand up for a community that seemed too afraid to stand up for itself? One evening, I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. It was held in the small community clubhouse, a building that usually sat empty. I arrived a few minutes early, hoping to get a sense of the atmosphere. Only a handful of people were there, perhaps 7 or 8 besides Brenda. Most were older residents, people I recognized but hadn't spoken to much. Brenda sat at the head of a long table, her expression formal and unyielding. The meeting began promptly. Brenda read through a list of agenda items, upcoming landscaping projects, a discussion about holiday decorations, and then, review of outstanding violations and associated fines. My heart gave a little jump. When my turn came, Brenda, without looking up from her notes, announced, "Mr. Miller, a Level 3 infraction fine of $1,500 for unauthorized exterior habitat modification, specifically the bird feeder. Removed within 24 hours. Fine stands." I cleared my throat. "Excuse me, Brenda," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I did remove the bird feeder, as instructed. But I'd like to understand the justification for the fine." I read through the bylaws, and there's no specific mention of bird feeders. I don't believe it attracted vermin, and it certainly wasn't a major alteration to the habitat. Brenda finally looked up, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with artificial patience, "the bylaws are quite clear on general upkeep and avoiding nuisances. A bird feeder, in my experience, leads to an increase in rodent activity and unsanitary conditions. As president, I have the authority to interpret these guidelines for the betterment of the community. The board has already reviewed and approved this decision." She gestured vaguely to the other silent board members. None of them met my eye. It was clear no actual review had taken place. There was no room for discussion, no empathy, no willingness to consider a different point of view. My voice, which had felt so confident moments before, now sounded small and isolated. The meeting moved on, leaving me feeling unheard and utterly defeated. I realized then that this wasn't just about rules, it was about power, and Brenda held all of it. She didn't want discussion, she wanted obedience. My attempts to reason, to apply logic, were useless against her unwavering authority. This wasn't a community, it was a kingdom, and Brenda was its undisputed queen. I left the meeting feeling heavier than when I arrived. The $1,500 fine now felt like a battle scar, a reminder of her absolute control. I had tried to be kind, to be understanding, but it had only made me a target. I decided I needed a different approach. I couldn't beat her at her own game, not yet. I needed to understand her weaknesses, to find a way to unravel her carefully constructed web of control. I needed to be smarter. In the days that followed, a strange curiosity began to grow within me. What else was Brenda hiding? What was the true source of her power? I started looking at things differently. Not just at my own property, but at the entire neighborhood, with Brenda as the central, controlling figure. I noticed that a small patch of land at the very end of our cul-de-sac, a grassy triangle that no one ever used, seemed to be getting a lot of Brenda's attention. She was often seen there, measuring, pacing, sometimes talking on her phone with a serious expression. It was technically a common area, but it was bordered by her property and was quite overgrown. I had always assumed it was just neglected, but now her intense focus on it seemed odd. One Tuesday morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw a small construction crew at the end of the street. They were putting up a new, imposing wooden fence. It wasn't around a house, it was around that small, unused grassy triangle, the common area Brenda had been so focused on. The fence was tall and solid, completely blocking off what had once been an open space. As I watched, Brenda walked over, supervising the workers, a satisfied smirk on her face. That afternoon, when I returned home, another letter was waiting for me. This one had an official-looking HOA logo, but it felt different, more menacing. The headline read, "Urgent Notice, Violation of Common Area Encroachment, Fine Imposed." My blood ran cold as I opened it. The letter stated that a recent survey had revealed that a portion of my driveway, specifically the small paved area where I sometimes parked my second car, was encroaching on this newly fenced common area by a mere 6 inches. It was a small, seemingly insignificant sliver of land, but the fine was anything but insignificant. Brenda had levied a $5,000 fine, demanding that I remove the encroachment within 48 hours or face further, escalating penalties, including legal action and potential lien on my property. This was no longer just about a bird feeder or potted plants. This was about my land, my property boundaries. The common area she had just fenced off, conveniently, now extended to claim a tiny portion of my private driveway. It was a brazen move, a clear escalation, and it made me wonder, for the first time, if her meticulous attention to rules hid something far more sinister, a deeper plan to slowly chip away at our properties for her own gain. What was she truly trying to achieve? And how far was she willing to go? The $5,000 fine for driveway encroachment was a punch to the gut. This wasn't a warning about my ferns or a bird feeder, this was Brenda trying to steal a piece of my land, however small. My heart pounded with a mix of fury and disbelief. 6 inches? A tiny sliver of paved driveway that had been there since the house was built, now suddenly an encroachment on a newly fenced-off, common area that Brenda clearly wanted for herself. The boldness of it, the sheer audacity, left me speechless for a moment. This wasn't about maintaining community standards, it was about outright theft, disguised under layers of rules and regulations. The feeling of injustice was overwhelming, a burning sensation in my chest that drowned out my usual desire to be understanding. My first thought was to march straight to Brenda's door and demand an explanation, but I knew that would be useless. Brenda never reasoned, she dictated. Instead, I carefully examined the letter again, looking for any loophole, any weakness. It mentioned a recent survey that had revealed the encroachment. A survey? I hadn't seen any surveyors on my property, nor had I been informed of one. This smelled fishy, like a carefully crafted lie. I knew deep down that my driveway was where it was supposed to be, well within my property lines. The injustice of it all kept me awake that night. I had always believed in treating others with respect, in finding common ground, in the idea that most people were inherently good. But Brenda was challenging every one of those beliefs. Her actions were not just unkind, they were predatory. I decided then and there that I could not simply pay this fine. This was no longer a minor nuisance, this was a direct attack on my home, my peace of mind, and my sense of security. I would fight this, not just for myself, but for the quiet, fearful neighbors who had clearly been suffering under Brenda's rule for far too long. If I didn't stand up, who would? The next morning, I drove to the county records office, a dull, brick building downtown that smelled of old paper and dust. I was a software guy, used to digital files and instant information, but I knew that for property records, sometimes you had to go old school. I found the property records department, a quiet room filled with towering shelves of heavy binders and large, rolled-up maps. A kind-faced clerk with reading glasses perched on her nose helped me navigate the system. I asked to see the official plat map for Maple Creek cul-de-sac, especially focusing on my address and the common areas. The map was a large, faded blueprint, crisscrossed with lines representing property boundaries, easements, and common areas. I found my lot, Lot 14, clearly marked with precise dimensions. I traced the boundary lines with my finger, then located the common area at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one Brenda had recently fenced off. My heart sank as I compared the map to what Brenda claimed. According to the official county plat, my driveway was indeed entirely within my property. The new fence, encompassing Brenda's supposed common area, seemed to be built around the original, smaller common area shown on the map, effectively expanding its footprint and, in doing so, claiming that sliver of my driveway. This was not an encroachment on my part, this was Brenda expanding the common area into my property. The map also clearly showed that the original common area was much smaller than the fenced-off portion, and it certainly didn't extend to my driveway. The fine was based on a lie, a fabricated encroachment. Brenda wasn't just controlling, she was outright deceptive. I requested copies of my property deed, the subdivision plat, and any recent surveys filed for the common area. The clerk looked a little surprised by my request for so many documents, but she quietly processed them. Back home, armed with my new stack of official documents, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had proof. But how to use it? I knew I couldn't just wave a map in Brenda's face. She would dismiss it, twist it, or find some other rule to counter me. I needed allies. I thought of the Patels, the young couple down the street, who had seemed equally frustrated at the last HOA meeting. Later that week, I baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies, my grandmother's recipe, famous for their warmth and comfort. I walked over to the Patels' house. Their names were Anya and Raj. They were a bright, enthusiastic couple who had just moved in a few months before me. Anya, with her quick smile, answered the door. "David. What a lovely surprise, and what smells amazing." "Chocolate chip cookies," I said, offering the plate. "I was hoping to talk to you about something, if you have a moment." We sat on their cozy porch swing, and I cautiously brought up the HOA. "I received another fine from Brenda," I began, explaining the $5,000 demand and my discovery at the county office. Anya and Raj listened intently, their initial politeness slowly giving way to shared frustration. "We knew it," Raj exclaimed, running a hand through his dark hair. "She fined us $1,000 last month for having our garden hose visible." "A garden hose?" We tried to argue, but she just quoted some vague rule about maintaining aesthetic harmony. Anya nodded, her expression grim. "It's constant. Every week, it's something new." She complained about the color of our welcome mat, saying it was too vibrant for the neighborhood's palate. We thought we were alone, that maybe we were just bad at understanding the rules. I shared my observations about Brenda's tactics, how she seemed to weaponize the vague bylaws, and how she controlled the HOA board. "She's banking on us being too busy, too tired, or too scared to fight back," I explained, showing them the property map. "But this new fine, it's different. This isn't just about a rule, it's about claiming our land. This common area, she just fenced off, it's much bigger than what's on the official map. She's expanding it, and using it to justify fining people for encroachment. Anya gasped, looking at the map I spread out on their patio table. "So, she's actually moving the lines? That's illegal, isn't it?" "It certainly feels that way," I said. "And if she can do it to me, she can do it to anyone. We need to do something. We can't let her keep pushing us around. We need to find out who else feels this way, and then, maybe, together, we can challenge her." Raj leaned forward, a spark of resolve in his eyes. "You're right, David. We've been too afraid to rock the boat. But this is too much. What do you propose?" We talked for hours, sharing stories of Brenda's various demands and fines. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone. We agreed to discreetly talk to other neighbors, to build a network of people who felt similarly oppressed. We had to be careful, though, Brenda clearly had eyes and ears everywhere. We decided to approach Mrs. Henderson first, then perhaps the older couple on the other side of her, the Parkers, who kept a very low profile. It was slow work, like trying to gather scattered grains of sand. Many neighbors were polite but clearly didn't want to get involved, fearing Brenda's wrath. They'd nod, sigh, and then make an excuse to go inside. But a few, like the Patels, listened intently, their quiet frustration turning into cautious hope. Mrs. Henderson, when I showed her the maps, looked troubled. I had a feeling something wasn't quite right with that new fence, she murmured, her brows furrowed. Brenda's always been about control, but this is different. This is her taking advantage. My dear, you must be very careful. Brenda has connections. She knows lawyers, surveyors, people who will back her up, even if it's wrong. Her words, while a warning, also felt like a quiet confirmation of my suspicions. I continued my research, delving into legal forums online, looking for information about HOA power and property disputes. It was a dense thicket of information, but one thing became clear: HOAs have a lot of power, but they are not above the law. They have to follow their own bylaws and state regulations. And land disputes are serious business. I also learned about something called an adverse possession, where someone can claim land if they occupy it openly for a certain number of years, even if it's not theirs. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Was this what Brenda was planning? Was she trying to slowly, piece by piece, take over parts of our properties? The thought of legal action, of hiring a lawyer, felt overwhelming. It was expensive, and I was still hoping to find a way to resolve this peacefully, perhaps by presenting irrefutable evidence at a larger, fairer HOA meeting, if I could somehow force one. I clung to the belief that if enough people spoke up, Brenda couldn't ignore them forever. I tried to maintain my calm, kind approach, even when faced with her escalating hostility. I reminded myself that anger only clouded judgment. Instead, I focused on gathering facts, on building a case brick by brick. Then, one brisk autumn morning, I woke up to an unusual amount of noise outside. Peeking through my curtains, I saw Brenda standing near the newly fenced, common area. She wasn't alone. A small utility truck was parked on the street, and two men in work uniforms were carefully digging around a small, green metal box that sat near the back corner of my property, close to the new fence. It was an old utility box, a small, unassuming thing that had always been there, just inside what I knew was my property line. My heart began to pound. What were they doing? I quickly dressed and hurried outside. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice firm. "What's going on here?" Brenda turned, her expression one of feigned surprise. "Oh, Mr. Miller. Good morning. We're just performing a routine adjustment of the common area boundaries. These gentlemen are moving this old utility access point to align with the newly surveyed common area line, which, as you know, encompasses a small portion of your driveway." She gestured vaguely to the fine letter. One of the workers pointed to the utility box. "This is just about 6 inches onto what's now designated common land, sir. We're just shifting it to the new marker." My eyes darted to the spot they were pointing to. 6 inches. Just a few steps from my property, yet it felt like a giant chasm. The utility box itself wasn't important, but Brenda was using it as a physical marker, a tangible sign of her claim on my land. This wasn't just paper fines anymore. She was physically moving the markers, literally changing the lines on the ground, making her false claims a physical reality. This was a direct, brazen act of asserting control over my property, right before my eyes. The casual way they were doing it, as if it was perfectly normal, sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like a deliberate provocation, a test of how far she could push, how much I would tolerate. What was next? Would she start moving my own fence? Would she claim my entire backyard? The question hung heavy in the crisp morning air, cold and menacing. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. The sight of Brenda, smug and supervising, while two men dug near my property line felt like a personal invasion. It was one thing to receive a threatening letter, it was another to watch her physically alter the boundary. The utility box, small and insignificant on its own, suddenly became a symbol of everything she was doing, a marker of her escalating claims. Brenda turned, her smile thin and unwavering. "Oh, Mr. Miller. Good morning. We're just performing a routine adjustment of the common area boundaries. These gentlemen are moving this old utility access point to align with the newly surveyed common area line, which, as you know, encompasses a small portion of your driveway." She gestured vaguely towards the previous fine letter, as if that piece of paper somehow made this act legitimate. The worker, oblivious or uncaring, continued to dig, their shovels biting into the earth. They quickly dislodged the small metal box, moving it just a few inches to align with the new, imaginary line Brenda had conjured. It was a minuscule shift, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to me, it was a giant leap into open warfare. It was a physical act of aggression, a deliberate erasure of my true boundary, pushing me back without a legal leg to stand on, all while she watched, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to remain calm. Arguing with her here, in front of the workers, would achieve nothing. She thrived on confrontation. I would not give her that satisfaction. As they finished, packing up their tools, Brenda gave me a dismissive nod. "There. All properly aligned now. Just ensuring our community standards are met, Mr. Miller." Her words, intended to sound reasonable, only fueled my quiet fury. I stood there, watching her walk away, the feeling of violation raw and sharp. She wasn't just fining me. She was literally trying to steal my land, piece by piece. This was a whole new level of extreme, a brazen manipulation of physical reality. I knew I couldn't undo what had just happened in that moment, but I could document it. I pulled out my phone and took a series of photos, capturing the moved utility box, the new fence, and the general area. I made sure to timestamp them. I then went inside and marked the original location of the utility box on a printout of my county plat map, using exact measurements. I even placed a small, almost invisible rock exactly where the utility box used to be, a tiny, personal act of resistance, a silent defiance against her territorial grab. I was learning to fight smart, not just with anger, but with facts and evidence. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. This was about Brenda's unchecked power and her blatant disregard for property rights and fairness. I thought about the community I wanted to be a part of, one where neighbors supported each other, where disagreements were resolved with understanding, not intimidation. Brenda was poisoning that vision, and it felt like it was up to me to find an antidote. My next step was to delve deeper into Brenda's past actions. If she was willing to falsify a survey and physically move property markers, what else had she done? I spent hours online, searching local county records beyond just property deeds. I looked for HOA filings, past meeting minutes, if they were public, and any legal disputes involving the Maple Creek HOA. It was a tedious process, filled with dry legal jargon and endless pages of documents. I learned that Brenda had been president for over 7 years, an unusually long time without any challenge. The records showed a steady increase in HOA fees over the years, with little explanation for the rising costs. There were also several small, settled lawsuits against the HOA, all related to disputed fines, which seemed to have been quietly resolved with homeowners paying a lesser amount, likely just to make Brenda go away. This suggested a pattern. She would threaten with huge fines, and people would pay a reduced amount rather than endure the fight. This was her playbook. I then reached out to Anya and Raj again. I shared my latest findings, explaining how Brenda was physically moving property markers under false pretenses. Anya's eyes widened. "That's insane, David. That's not just a fine, that's literally stealing land." Raj nodded, his expression grim. "We need to get more people on board. If she's doing this to you, who's next? What if she starts claiming parts of our yards?" We decided to hold a very informal, very quiet, coffee meetup at a local coffee shop a few miles away from the neighborhood, just to be safe. We invited a few other neighbors we knew were quietly frustrated with Brenda, the Parkers, a quiet older couple, and a young single mom named Sarah, who had recently been fined for a small playhouse in her backyard that Brenda claimed was too tall. It was a small group, but it was a start. At the coffee shop, away from Brenda's watchful eyes, everyone spoke more freely. The room buzzed with hushed stories of ridiculous fines, petty complaints, and Brenda's intimidating presence. Sarah talked about how the fine for her daughter's playhouse had devastated her, as she was already struggling with bills. Mr. Parker recounted how Brenda had forced him to repaint his mailbox 3 times to get the correct shade of beige. Mrs. Henderson, who also joined us, spoke softly, her wisdom comforting. "It's been building for years, dear ones. Brenda has a way of making everyone feel like they're doing something wrong. She thrives on fear." I shared my findings from the county office, showing them the official plat maps and explaining how Brenda had essentially fabricated the encroachment on my driveway. The group gasped when I told them about the utility box being physically moved. "She's literally changing the land." Mrs. Parker exclaimed, her voice trembling. "That's not just an HOA, that's a tyranny." I brought up the idea of challenging her, perhaps by calling for a special HOA meeting or even exploring legal options as a group. A few people looked hesitant, but the shared sense of injustice was palpable. We agreed that simply paying the fines was no longer an option. It was clear Brenda saw our compliance as weakness. We needed to show her we were united, that her tactics would no longer work. We decided to gather more evidence, to keep a detailed log of every interaction with Brenda, every fine, every suspicious activity. We were building a case, not just for ourselves, but for the entire community. The shared frustration began to transform into a quiet, determined resolve. The inspiring part was seeing these quiet, previously isolated people, begin to find their voices, driven by a desire for fairness and a safe home. I also consulted a property lawyer for a brief, free consultation. The lawyer, a friendly woman named Ms. Davies, listened patiently to my story. "This sounds like a classic case of an overreaching HOA president," she said, tapping her pen on her desk. "Moving property markers is a serious issue. You have a strong case if you have documented proof from the county. The issue is, legal battles with HOAs can be long and expensive. Most people don't want to go through it. That's what Brenda is counting on." She advised me to continue gathering all evidence, including photos, official maps, and communications. She suggested finding more aggrieved neighbors to potentially share legal costs, or to present a united front to the HOA board. It reinforced my belief that unity was our strongest weapon. As the weeks passed, Brenda seemed to sense my growing resistance, or perhaps she was just becoming more brazen. The notices started coming faster, and they were increasingly absurd. First, a fine for unapproved lighting on my porch, my perfectly normal, dim porch light that had been there for months. Then, a fine for excessive noise disturbance from my air conditioning unit, which was just a normal humming sound. It felt like she was trying to overwhelm me, to bury me in paperwork and financial threats. She was escalating her psychological warfare, attempting to break me. Then, one sunny Saturday afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, something truly outlandish occurred. A small, official-looking sign had been hammered into the grass right next to my mailbox. It was a bright yellow sign, about a foot tall, with bold black letters. It read, "HOA property, no trespassing." It was placed barely an inch beyond where my mailbox stood, on what I knew, from my official county plat, was clearly part of my front lawn. My mower stopped dead. My mailbox, something I owned, now stood next to a sign claiming the land right beneath it was HOA property. It was such a small sign, easily missed, but the message was chilling. It wasn't just a fine or a demand, it was a silent, physical declaration of ownership, moving the boundary of her claimed common area even further into my yard, right up to my mailbox. It was a bizarre, almost comical act of aggression, yet the implication was terrifying. Brenda was not just disputing my property lines, she was actively, physically trying to claim more and more of my land, little by little, inches by inches, right out in the open. The sheer audacity of it, coupled with the constant stream of petty fines, left me reeling. What was her endgame? How much of my property did she plan to slowly absorb before I even realized what was happening? My mower stopped dead. The small yellow sign, hammered into the ground barely an inch from my mailbox, screamed its message, HOA property, no trespassing. It was such a small thing, a foot tall at most, but it felt like a giant middle finger from Brenda, a deliberate poke right in my eye. This wasn't just a fine or a demand, this was her physically planting her flag on my front lawn, claiming a piece of my actual property. The audacity, the sheer nerve of it, made my blood run hot. This was no longer just about petty rules or vague boundaries, this was an act of open defiance against my ownership, against my peace. I stood there, staring at the sign, feeling a tremor of anger. My property, my home, was supposed to be my safe haven, a place of peace. But Brenda was systematically turning it into a battleground. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to rip the sign out of the ground and throw it directly at her house. But I stopped myself. Violence was not the answer, and I needed to be smarter than her. I pulled out my phone, took multiple pictures of the sign from different angles, making sure to capture its placement next to my mailbox and the surrounding grass, all of which was clearly on my land according to the county plat. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I carefully pulled the sign out of the ground, leaving no mark behind. I would not let her claim even an inch without a fight. I brought the sign inside, another piece of evidence in my growing collection. It was a tangible symbol of her aggressive, illegal overreach, a clear warning of how far she was willing to go. This act of physical encroachment was a turning point. The stream of petty fines had been annoying, the driveway dispute maddening, but this was a direct, brazen attempt to steal my land, right in front of my face. My initial desire for kindness, for finding a middle ground, hardened into a clear resolve. Brenda wasn't just a nuisance, she was a threat. And I would not let her win. I called an urgent meeting with our small group of concerned neighbors, Anya and Raj, Mrs. Henderson, and Sarah. We met again at the quiet coffee shop, the air buzzing with a nervous energy that quickly turned into shared outrage as I showed them the pictures of the HOA property sign. "I can't believe this," Anya exclaimed, her voice hushed but filled with disbelief. "She actually put a sign on your lawn? That's insane." Raj slammed his hand softly on the table. "This is beyond ridiculous. This is clearly illegal. She has no right to claim your private property like that." Sarah, who usually seemed so worn down, looked energized by my story. "This is it," she declared. "This is the proof we need. No one can defend this." Even Mrs. Henderson, typically so cautious, looked genuinely angry. "My goodness, Brenda has truly lost her way. This is not how a community functions. This is an abuse of power." The sign became a rallying point. It was so obviously wrong, so undeniably aggressive, that it pushed more neighbors over the edge. Our little group started growing. Anya and Raj were excellent at quietly spreading the word, inviting others who had expressed frustrations with Brenda to our discreet coffee meetings. We talked about a quiet elderly couple, the Davidsons, who had been fined repeatedly for their beloved bird bath, and a single dad, Mr. Johnson, who had received a fine for his son's basketball hoop. They all had similar stories of Brenda's relentless control and absurd demands. Each new person brought more stories, more evidence, and more fuel to our collective fire. The quiet fear that had held the neighborhood captive for so long was slowly beginning to crack, replaced by a growing murmur of discontent. We started brainstorming concrete actions. We discussed demanding a truly transparent HOA board meeting, one where Brenda couldn't simply railroad decisions. We considered getting a formal audit of HOA funds, as my research had shown some unexplained fee increases. Raj, being good with computers, offered to set up a secure online forum for the growing number of concerned homeowners, a place where we could share information and strategize without fear of Brenda monitoring us. We even talked about preparing a petition to remove Brenda from her presidency, though we knew that would be a monumental task. Our strength was in our numbers, in our shared experiences, and in our refusal to be intimidated any longer. I continued my own meticulous research. I delved deeper into state laws regarding HOAs and property rights, specifically looking for precedents on adverse possession or property line disputes within community associations. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Brenda's claims were baseless and illegal. I found articles about homeowners who had successfully sued their HOAs for overreach. It gave me a glimmer of hope. I also started observing Brenda even more closely. She still took her daily walks, but now, her gaze lingered strangely on the back of my property, especially near my main fence line, the one that ran along the very back of my yard. I also noticed her frequently talking on her phone, often in hushed tones, while staring at that particular section of my fence. It was a subtle thing, but it sent a chill down my spine. It felt like she was planning her next move, a bigger, more audacious one, and it involved my backyard. The constant barrage of new, nonsensical fines continued to arrive in my mailbox. A fine for unapproved landscaping material, because a single maple leaf had fallen onto my perfectly manicured lawn from my neighbor's tree. A fine for excessive noise from gardening activities, because I had used a hand rake on a Saturday morning. Each fine was smaller than the $5,000 driveway fine, perhaps $100 or $200, but they accumulated quickly, and the sheer volume of them was designed to overwhelm me, to make me feel like I was drowning in paperwork and petty accusations. It was a deliberate strategy to break my spirit, to make me give up the fight. Then, one Thursday morning, a registered letter arrived, unlike any of the others. It was thick, heavy, and felt official in a way that truly terrified me. The HOA letterhead was crisp, and Brenda's signature, usually so precise, was bold and aggressive. The title of the notice was stark, urgent and final notice. Repeated violations of community peace and unauthorized organizing against HOA directives, maximal fine imposed. My hands shook as I pulled out the document. The amount listed was a shocking $50,000. $50,000. It was an astronomical sum, far more than any previous fine, seemingly plucked from thin air. The letter claimed I was causing severe disruption to the tranquil harmony of Maple Creek through my covert attempts to undermine the duly elected HOA leadership. It even mentioned the unauthorized assembly of residents, clearly indicating she knew about our coffee shop meetings. The letter ended with a chilling threat: failure to remit this payment within 7 days will result in immediate legal action, including but not limited to, the placement of a lien on your property and a forced sale to recover outstanding dues. My breath hitched. $50,000. It was an impossible sum, designed to crush me, to silence me, to make me abandon my home. This wasn't just a fine, it was a declaration of war, a desperate attempt by Brenda to assert her absolute power before our growing resistance could fully bloom. She had gone from petty complaints to physical encroachments, and now to an attempt to financially ruin me and force me out of my house. The sheer vindictiveness of it, the desperation in her attempt to stop our organizing efforts, was terrifying. But beneath the fear, a new feeling solidified within me, a grim determination. She had truly overplayed her hand. This impossible fine, this blatant attempt to destroy my life, would not break me. It would only strengthen my resolve to uncover every single one of her secrets, no matter how deep she tried to bury them. Her desperation revealed her fear. And fear made people reckless. My mind raced, trying to understand what she was hiding, what dark secret would justify such extreme measures. The $50,000 fine was not just a piece of paper, it was Brenda's last, desperate roar. It landed in my hands, a stark white rectangle, its words screaming accusations of repeated violations of community peace and unauthorized organizing against HOA directives. $50,000. An impossible sum. It was her final, desperate attempt to crush me, to silence the growing whispers of dissent in the neighborhood. My first reaction was a gasp, a hollow feeling in my chest, but then, a strange calm settled over me. This was it. This was her fear showing. She knew we were onto her, that her tight grip on Maple Creek was slipping. This wasn't a sign of strength, it was a sign of a cornered bully. I immediately shared the letter with our group of concerned neighbors. We huddled together in the Patel's living room, the outrageous amount spread out on their coffee table. Anya gasped, Raj shook his head in disbelief, and Sarah's eyes blazed with a fierce anger. Even Mrs. Henderson, usually so composed, let out a small cry of outrage. $50,000? For trying to talk to your neighbors? This is beyond anything I've seen in all my years, she declared, her voice firm. The sheer absurdity of the fine had an unexpected effect, it ignited a collective fury that extinguished any lingering fear. She's terrified, I explained, my voice steady. She knows we're organized. This is her trying to break us before we can expose her. Our small group, now numbering almost a dozen, looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between us. We weren't just fighting for my backyard or David's bird bath, we were fighting for the soul of our community, for fairness, for the right to live in peace in our own homes. We were not going to let Brenda win. This was our moment to stand united, to show what kindness, courage, and a shared purpose could achieve. We doubled down on our efforts. Raj's online forum became a hub of activity, with neighbors posting their own horror stories, sharing photos of alleged violations, and comparing notes on Brenda's bizarre demands. We found a dozen similar stories of disproportionate fines, of rules being bent to Brenda's will, and of community funds being spent on projects that seemed only to benefit her property or to cement her control. We suspected she was misusing HOA funds, perhaps even paying for her own improvements under the guise of community projects. We started planning to demand a full audit of HOA finances, not just a review of recent expenses, but a deep dive into years of spending. My mind kept going back to Brenda's strange focus on my backyard fence, the one at the very back of my property. I remembered the satellite image from the very first $840,000 demand letter, the one that showed her new flower beds. That letter had claimed unapproved landscaping changes and structural infractions from me, but it also showed her new garden. The pieces began to click into place. Brenda wasn't just claiming a sliver of my driveway or planting a sign on my lawn. She was doing something far more serious. I decided to perform my own amateur survey of my backyard. Armed with a long tape measure, the county plat map, and a healthy dose of suspicion, I began measuring from the back wall of my house, following the lines on the official map. My heart pounded as I worked, step by careful step. My map showed my property line extending several feet past where my old, slightly dilapidated wooden fence stood. My fence was on my land, just barely. But Brenda's fence, the one that marked the boundary of her property, seemed to be built a little bit beyond where it should be. And her meticulously landscaped garden, the one I had seen in the satellite picture from that very first letter, the one with the vibrant red petunias, was located right beyond her fence. That garden, I realized with a chilling certainty, was actually on my land. I remeasured, double-checked, and even asked Raj to come over with his more precise laser measuring tool. We spent an entire afternoon, meticulously charting out the property lines. The results were undeniable. Brenda's fence, and therefore her garden, had been built at least 5 feet onto my property, along the entire length of our shared backyard boundary. She wasn't just moving utility boxes or planting signs, she was illegally squatting on my land. She had slowly, deliberately, and secretly, expanded her backyard by stealing a 5-foot-wide strip of my property, a strip that stretched for almost 50 feet. And then, she had the incredible nerve to demand $840,000 from me, citing unapproved landscaping changes and structural infractions that were, in fact, changes she herself had made while trespassing on my property. The original $840,000 demand, which had felt like an absurd fiction, now made terrifying sense. She wanted me to pay for her illegal actions on my land. The discovery was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't just a fine, it was a brazen, calculated land grab. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was a thief. And this had been her plan all along, from the first petty fine to the new, common area, fence, all designed to distract and intimidate while she slowly, subtly, expanded her own domain. We immediately called for an emergency HOA meeting, demanding Brenda answer for the mounting fines and, most importantly, for the increasingly blatant discrepancies in property lines. Our petition, now signed by over 20 homeowners, forced her hand. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the clubhouse, the same place where I had felt so small and unheard before. This time, it would be different. The clubhouse was packed. Neighbors who had always stayed silent now filled the chairs, their faces a mixture of nervousness and fierce determination. Brenda sat at the head of the table, her usual stern expression firmly in place, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled her papers. She started the meeting by announcing new, even stricter rules for lawn maintenance and detailing her plan for another community improvement project, which suspiciously involved more fencing. She rattled off the usual complaints, avoiding eye contact with the growing number of angry faces. Then, she tried to announce a special assessment for the $50,000 fine, stating it was for my disruptive behavior. "Excuse me, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the air, stronger and clearer than I ever thought possible. The room fell silent. "Before you discuss any more fines or assessments, I think we need to address something far more serious." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Miller, you are out of order. This is a duly called meeting, and we are following procedure." "Procedure?" Anya spoke up, standing beside me, her voice ringing with newfound courage. "What about procedure when you illegally claim our land?" Then, Raj, Sarah, Mrs. Henderson, and the other brave neighbors stood up, one by one. The sight of their united front, their faces resolved, gave me a surge of strength. I pulled out my stack of documents. The county plat map, my photos of the moved utility box, the HOA property sign, and then, the crucial evidence of her backyard encroachment. "Brenda," I stated, my voice echoing in the silent room, "you sent me a letter demanding $840,000 for unapproved landscaping changes and structural infractions. But those changes weren't made by me. They were made by you." I placed the original $840,000 demand letter on the table, pointing to the satellite image. "This picture shows your new garden, Brenda. But what it doesn't show is that this garden is not on your land. It's on my land." I unrolled my enlarged copy of the county plat map and pointed to the precise measurements. "According to the official county records, my property line extends 5 feet beyond where your fence currently stands. Your entire garden, the one you're so proud of, is built on my property. You are illegally squatting on my land, and you have the audacity to demand nearly $1 million from me for your own theft." A collective gasp swept through the room. Neighbors whispered, their eyes darting between Brenda and the maps. Brenda's face went white. Her composure, so meticulously maintained for years, began to crack. "That's preposterous," she stammered, her voice high-pitched and shaky. "That's a common area. I had it surveyed." "And what survey was that, Brenda?" I challenged, holding up a copy of the official county plat. "Because this is the only official survey filed with the county, and it clearly shows that garden, and your fence, are 5 feet into my property. And while we're talking about surveys, perhaps you can explain why you physically moved a utility box onto my property, claiming it was for a newly surveyed common area that doesn't exist on any legal map? I held up the photos of the moved utility box, then the HOA property, no trespassing sign. And why you planted this sign on my front lawn, trying to claim more of my land. The Patels stepped forward with their own binders of evidence, the ridiculous fines they had received, the records of HOA fees that seemed to disappear without explanation, and a detailed list of other neighbors' similar complaints. Sarah spoke about the playhouse, Mr. Parker about his mailbox. The room erupted into a clamor of voices, neighbors shouting their own grievances, their fear finally replaced by righteous anger. Brenda stood up, her face a blotchy red, her eyes darting around frantically. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the roar of accusations. She looked terrified, utterly exposed. The carefully constructed facade of her power crumbled around her. The other HOA board members, who had always been silent, now looked utterly horrified, their faces pale. One of them, an older gentleman named Mr. Rodriguez, finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Brenda, this is unacceptable. This is not what we agreed to. We had no idea." Brenda made a desperate lunge for the door, trying to escape the furious crowd. But Anya, quick on her feet, moved to block her path. "You're not going anywhere, Brenda," she declared, her voice firm. "Not until we get some answers, and not until you face what you've done." Just then, 2 sheriff's deputies, summoned by a worried Mrs. Henderson earlier that morning, entered the clubhouse. Their presence quieted the room, though the tension remained thick in the air. I stepped forward, holding out the $840,000 demand letter, Brenda's illegal squatting evidence, and the stack of other damning documents. "Officers," I said, my voice steady, "we have evidence that the HOA president, Brenda Peterson, has been defrauding the homeowners, illegally claiming private property, and attempting to extort exorbitant sums of money." The officers listened intently as I explained, showing them the clear county maps and the physical evidence of the encroachment. They looked at Brenda, whose face was now a mask of terror. She tried to deny everything, babbling about misunderstandings and interpretations of bylaws, but her words were hollow. The weight of the evidence, and the unanimous testimony of dozens of angry neighbors, was overwhelming. Brenda Peterson, the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Creek, was led away by the deputies, her reign of terror brought to a sudden, ignominious end. The clubhouse erupted in cheers, a wave of relief washing over the community. People hugged, tears in their eyes, finally free from Brenda's oppressive rule. The $840,000 demand, the very thing that had sent shivers down my spine months ago, was now just a symbol of her spectacular downfall. It had been her biggest gamble, and it had cost her everything. In the days and weeks that followed, the Maple Creek HOA was completely reformed. The old board members resigned, ashamed of their inaction. A new, transparent board was elected, with Mrs. Henderson stepping up as interim president, and Raj and Anya taking active roles. They immediately began the process of auditing the old HOA's finances, overturning Brenda's unjust fines, and, most importantly, restoring accurate property lines. The fence Brenda had built on my land was carefully removed, and my backyard returned to its rightful size. My driveway was confirmed to be entirely on my property, and the common area was restored to its original, smaller footprint. The absurd $840,000 demand was, of course, thrown out, along with the $50,000 fine and all the others. The community, once fractured by fear, slowly began to heal. Neighbors started talking, truly talking, sharing stories and offering help. Children played freely in yards that no longer felt watched. My bird feeder went back up, now a symbol of freedom rather than rebellion, and its cheerful chirping filled my backyard once more. I saw Mrs. Henderson smiling freely, Anya and Raj thriving, and Sarah's daughter laughing as she played in her perfectly legal, Brenda-approved playhouse. The dream I had for my home, for a community built on kindness and understanding, finally began to blossom. It turned out that sometimes, standing up for yourself, even when it feels scary, is the most profound act of kindness you can offer to everyone around you.